look, the financial press is calling it a routine personnel change at the Federal Reserve. Jerome Powell's term ends. Kevin Warsh, Trump's pick, takes over. Move along. Nothing to see here. But I think we've been lied to about what just quietly happened between these two men. Because what Powell did on April 29th was the first time a Fed chair has done it in 78 years. And what Warsh said the week before should have made every saver in this country sit up straight. Three things hit on the same day. The Federal Reserve held rates at 3.75%. 4 committee members voted against the chair, the most dissents at a single meeting since October of 1992, a time when achy breaky heart was terrorizing the radio and we still collectively thought slap bracelets were a viable fashion choice. And in his press conference, Jerome Powell had one last thing to say before he leaves on May 15th. He announced he isn't leaving. He's keeping his vote through January of 2028. So let's read the box score on that one. The man who's supposed to walk out the door in just a few days isn't walking out the door. And by staying, Powell is delivering a message to the man taking his job. And that message changes everything about what we were expecting to happen to our money over the next decade, let alone the next 12 months. Powell didn't ask for permission to stay. He doesn't need it. His chair term ends May 15th, but his governor term runs through January of 28. And by law, the president cannot fire a sitting Fed governor over policy disagreements. Powell holds the keys. Trump can't take them. He can only wait Powell out or pressure him out, both of which are happening right now in public. So here are the questions we need to answer to figure out what's really going on. First, why is a man who could walk into a corporate board seat and a quiet retirement choosing to stay and dissent? Who is Kevin Warsh actually? And what did he say in his confirmation hearing that made Powell decide 21 more months of votes was worth the fight? Has this ever happened before in American history? And when it did, what happened to the dollar? And the question that might matter the most, why is JP Morgan quietly telling its billionaire clients to move 60% of their portfolios out of the dollar in the same week? Now, these are the questions. There's no leaked memo with the answers. There's no transcript of a private conversation, but the actions are speaking so loudly. Does it matter what anyone says? I mean, I can show you what I'm seeing, and then you can decide for yourself. Because what's happening isn't so much about a Fed personnel change as it is about whether the firewall that protects your dollar from politicians still works, and what to do with your money while we find out. And whether Powell's stand holds or fails decides whether the dollar's sitting in your savings account today buy the same groceries next year, or half as many, if you're lucky. So let's start with the first question. What did Powell actually see? Well, on May 15th, the man who's been running the most powerful institution in your financial life, Jerome Powell, packs up his office and moves down the hall. And the man, Kevin Warsh, walking in, taking his seat, just told the United States Senate on tape that he wants to do something to the dollar that hasn't been attempted in 78 years. So here's what Powell saw. A president who'd spent 2 years trying to fire him. A DOJ probe that tried to use a building renovation as a removal pretext. A Treasury secretary openly demanding loyalty. And now a successor walking in promising regime change at the institution that anchors your dollar. 4 moves, 2 years, all in one direction. Powell saw a Federal Reserve being slowly captured, and he understood that walking out the door meant handing over the last line of defense. So he made a choice. On April 29th at his press conference, Powell looked at the cameras and said, and I'm quoting directly, "I had long planned to be retiring. The things that have happened really in the last 3 months have, I think, left me no choice but to stay." For 75 years, every Fed chair has done the same thing on their last day, cleaned out the office, handed over the gavel, and left the building. Powell isn't doing any of that. He's keeping a voting seat on the Board of Governors through January of 28. 21 more months of votes. 21 more months of public dissents if he wants them. And look, this isn't a small move. The last Fed chair who refused to leave the board after his term ended was Marriner Eccles, 1948, 78 years ago. Truman pushed Eccles out as chair, and Eccles said, "Fine, I'll stop being chair, but I'm not leaving." He kept his seat, he kept his vote, and he kept a spare key to the dollar. That's exactly what Powell just did. But why would he do that? What is Powell afraid the new chair will do? Who is Warsh, really? Kevin Warsh has been packaged on the news recently as a serious institutionalist. Stanford, Harvard Law, former Fed governor, financial crisis veteran, the official story. But there's a different story buried in his actual statements on the record. April 21st, Senate Banking Committee, Warsh's confirmation hearing. He's asked about inflation. He answers, and I'm quoting again, "I think that means a regime change in the conduct of policy. I think that means a different new inflation framework." Regime change, not policy adjustment. Regime change, that is not a phrase you want to hear applied to the institution anchoring your money. You want to hear regime change applied to the Hollywood Foreign Press Association, or perhaps a problematic local HOA, not the US dollar. This is the man who's about to take over the institution that decides what your dollar is worth. And he's not coming from a university. He's a partner at Stanley Druckenmiller's hedge fund, one of the most powerful macro investors alive. The man about to lead the Federal Reserve has spent the last 15 years thinking about how to profit from Fed decisions, not how to make them. And here's the part nobody mentioned. In 2018, long before any of this, Warsh was asked by Politico whether Trump understood the historical importance of Fed independence. In his exact words, "This might be a good time for a no comment." Now you can read that two ways. Either Warsh knew Trump didn't respect Fed independence and took the job anyway, or Trump knew Warsh had said it on the record and picked him anyway. Both reads are uncomfortable. Both reads end with the same Fed chair walking into the building on May 16th. It's tough to tell what this means explicitly unless you have precedent. Has this happened before? Because that would be our biggest clue. Well, fortunately, there is a playbook that decides whether your dollar makes it through. And the man who wrote it did exactly what Powell just did. It was back in 1951. Picture this. Marriner Eccles, 3 years removed from being chair, sitting on the board as regular governor, gets called to the White House. Truman's there. The entire Federal Open Market Committee is there. The president wants the Fed to keep interest rates pegged low to finance the Korean War. Inflation is running at 21%. Eccles knows the Fed can't manage both. So the meeting ends, and Truman walks to the press and says the Federal Open Market Committee, or FOMC, this is the Federal Reserve's monetary policy-making body, they pledged its support. And it was a total fabrication. The committee made no such pledge. So Eccles does something nobody expected. He releases the committee's own version of the meeting without consulting the rest of the committee. So basically, he blows up the lie. And the standoff that follows produces the March 14, 1951 Treasury-Fed Accord, the agreement that built the firewall between political pressure and monetary policy. 75 years of dollar stability came from that one act of insurgency. The chair who got installed after the accord, William McChesney Martin, kept the firewall standing for 19 years, and Truman never forgave him. Years later, the two of them happened to cross paths on Fifth Avenue in New York. Truman looked at Martin and said one word: traitor. That's how the political class talks about the people who actually saved the dollar. Eccles used his spare key. The system worked, and the man who did the right thing got called a traitor on a Manhattan sidewalk. So, will history repeat itself? Is Powell doing the right thing? What if Powell didn't stay? Because 20 years later, the opposite took place. It's a Wednesday afternoon in October. Richard Nixon is in the Oval Office now. And he's had it with Martin, the man who's been keeping the inflation lid on for 19 years, the man Truman called a traitor. So Martin's term is ending, and Nixon picks Arthur Burns to replace him. He picks Burns specifically because he thinks Burns will be loyal. He thinks Burns will give him cheap money before the 1972 election. Burns gets sworn in, he doesn't keep a spare key, and he hands Nixon the master. Now, watch what happens. CPI inflation in 1969 is running about 5%. Bad, but manageable. By 1974, it's 11%. By 1980, 11 years after Burns walked in, it's 13.5%. The savings accounts that anchored every retiree's plan in 1969 are paying out half the purchasing power they started with by 1980. The savers who followed conventional wisdom, pay off the house, keep cash in the bank, trust the system, they got destroyed. Their solvency evaporated. The people who got rich in that decade did one thing. They borrowed money at fixed rates, and they bought hard assets, real estate, gold, anything tangible. While the cash savers watch their solvency evaporate, the real estate operators watch their mortgages shrink in real terms while their rents and home values inflated. Inflation arbitrage, the textbook play. It built fortunes that decade. And here's the part that should cause you to pause and evaluate your next move. Same setup is loading right now. Trump Warsh isn't a metaphor for Nixon Burns. No, it's the same architecture. A president who wants cheap money. A new chair who's been promising regime change out loud, and an ongoing chair who's seen the movie before and won't leave the theater because he knows how it ends. Now, I can't prove what comes next, but JP Morgan can, and they're publishing it for the people who can afford to read their report. 333 families, average net worth $1.6 billion. Here's what they're actually doing with their money right now. The JP Morgan Private Bank Global Family Office report came out in February, and 64% of those families named interest rates as the biggest risk to their portfolio. 61% named inflation. These are the people the system actually tells the truth to. So what are they doing? Well, they're not staying the course. They're not in the 0.38% savings account that the FDIC says is the national average. They're running 60% of their portfolios in alternatives, twice the average exposure to real estate and hedge funds. And Cambridge Associates, the institutional consulting firm the ultra-wealthy use, tells its clients flat out, investors should remain underweight the US dollar. In other words, they're telling the rich to get out of dollars, and they're telling them quietly. You see, your fee-based advisor reads the same Cambridge report. He just doesn't tell you, and there's 3 reasons why. First, liability. If he tells you to act on Fed policy speculation and he's wrong, he gets sued. 2, the business model. Defensive moves mean liquidating positions, which means smaller paychecks. And 3, the blind spot. Most advisors were trained in the 1990s and the 2010s era of Fed credibility. They've never operated in a politicized Fed environment. They literally don't know what to tell you. And look, I'm just a guy who buys houses for a living. I never thought I'd be on YouTube reading from the JP Morgan Family Office report. I didn't even know the thing existed 24 months ago. But the data is the data. While you're being told to stay calm, the people who can afford to be calm are quietly moving 60% of their money out of the dollar and into hard assets. That's not paranoia. That's the playbook. Which means the question isn't whether to act. The question is which one of the 3 specific moves you make this week, before Powell hands over the building on May 15th, before Warsh's first meeting on June 16th, before the window closes. Well, there's 3 moves. Pick one. Move number 1, tighten the basics. This is the version for the retiree who doesn't want to make any major moves but wants to stop bleeding from the obvious leaks. Pull your most recent bank statement out of the kitchen drawer right now. Look at the savings interest rate printed on the page. If it says anything under 1%, you're in that 0.38% crowd. So open a new tab. Search Top High Yield Savings May 2026. Pick one paying 4% or better. Move the money. Same FDIC protection, 10 times the return. I mean, on $50,000 of idle cash, that single 15-minute move recovers about $2,000 a year. Liquidity restored. Done. I posted the 3 accounts that I use at stackmybanks.com. Move 2, defensive structuring. This is the war chest move. A portion of your liquid assets converted to physical precious metals as a hedge against the Fed losing credibility. There's a link in the description for hedgethefed.com because it's easy to make mistakes buying precious metals, and that resource will help you make smarter decisions. Look into a HELOC or a fallback line of credit to set up now, while underwriting is still normal, before Warsh-era volatility tightens lending. And I'll put some links for those resources below for you also, in case you need them. And for substantial home equity, protecting the deed inside an LLC or trust structure so a politicized environment doesn't expose your fortress to lawsuit risk. Active defense, gotta layer it. Move 3, strategic offense. Now, this is inflation arbitrage in textbook form. Consider using existing home equity to acquire cash-flowing rental real estate with fixed-rate leverage. Consider it, because the debt shrinks in real terms while the asset and the rents inflate. If you don't like it, I get it, but it is the same play the family offices are running at twice the average exposure right now. Different link in the description for the turnkey real estate side of that. In fact, you know what? I'll just put it all into one checklist to make it easy for you. But pick one of the 3, at least one. Take one action this week. The information, it's on the table. And look, Powell didn't refuse to leave because of an investigation. He refused to leave because he saw Warsh promise to reopen the 1951 Accord, the document that protects your dollar from political interference. And he understood that the only way to defend it was to stay in the building and keep a spare key. So you have two paths you could follow. Path A, do nothing. Leave your savings where it is. Trust your advisor. Wait and see what happens after May 15th. I mean, if history rhymes with 1969, you'll have less buying power every year for the next 10. Or path B, take action. Pick one of the three moves I just laid out, at least one. The checklist is in the description below for you. Do it this week, before May 15th, while the rules are still the ones you know. Here's the thing though, even if you do everything right this week, move the cash, build the war chest, lock in the fortress, there's still the biggest part of your money that I haven't talked about yet. What this means for your home. Because while we've been watching Powell and Warsh fight over the value of the dollar at the top of the system, inflation has been doing something to the dollar at the bottom of it, specifically the dollar sitting inside your home equity. And it's more than just inflation that's stealing your equity faster than your home value is growing. And that's why I pulled this video out right here for you to watch next. I walk through exactly how all three different mechanisms are working against you. In plain English, with no Fed jargon, it'll be really easy to understand and give you three specific things that you can do this week to slow the bleeding. So watch this one next, and I'll see you on the other side. God loves you, and so do I. Take care.